Thank you very much for having me. I looked through the program, and since I am the last speaker, it's really a good thing because what I think I'm going to say is what you've already heard. So this will be a reinforcement of what you've heard. The program was outstanding. I was held up, as it were. I had another talk to give in the town hall in Sydney to the leaders of our local governments in New South Wales. And I wish you were there because they haven't got the message yet. They're still planning for the past and not the future. Let's see, where's my clicker here? I'm going to go relatively quickly, but I hope smoothly, through some remarks about where I think we ought to be collectively, and end on where I think Australia in particular needs to be. And many of you from other countries may already be there, are thinking about moving to the space. I'm going to be very local in my orientation. I think you've taken a broader contextual perspective, but I'm going to be pretty local. And I'm not talking about local government, but localities, because we have to do this job of making smart infrastructure in localities. And you can see from this picture, this is from New Orleans, this is the crumbling of the social, and the physical, and the economic infrastructure right here. Because when things start falling apart, everything falls apart. And those of you who've lived through disasters and understand disasters, that the community is fractured in this whole disaster scenario. And so, what's happening here? Am I hitting the right one? Let me try the other side. Nothing's happening. It did? It moved? So, we've only got a limited amount of space. That space is becoming tighter and tighter because as we urbanize, we're living on smaller and smaller land masses. And that presents some particular problems that we have to be very smart about. And when I say infrastructure, and I think when you say infrastructure, it's not just the pipes and things under the ground or the wires overhead. The infrastructure includes all that telecommunications infrastructure, all the ways in which people communicate with one another, work with one another, meet and greet one another. So we have to do this in smaller and smaller spaces, and we have to be much wiser about how we do it. Today, we don't do it very well at all. This is just the United States. It's certainly not Europe. We spend most of our energy, transportation with coal and gas, and Australia looks very much like this. 30% of our is with oil, a diminishing resource. And our buildings, the way they're built and so forth, gobble up an awful lot, 42% of our energy industry, 76%, electricity and so on. So we're gobbling up diminishing resources with horrible effects for our environment, and we have a leadership gap. I could have put other pictures there, but I chose to put one that is no longer in office, thank God. But what is even worse is that we have an environmental gap. And those of you who come from China, Indonesia, and elsewhere, and I spent a great deal of time in China, and I've spent time in Indonesia and so on, one of the problems we have is the movement in your countries, and the country I live in now, Australia, and formerly the United States, to the suburban system. And the suburban system is the dumbest possible organization of space and requires an infinite amount of resources and is very difficult to retrofit. And one of the themes I'm going to keep going on over and over and over again here is we don't have the possibility for redundancy in our infrastructure system. That is, if something breaks, we haven't got something to replace it that can continue it, it is a bad system. And our freeways and the roads and things that we built now, that road infrastructure is an infrastructure. We just had one little breakdown yesterday in Sydney. And I was at the University of Sydney, which was very far away. This was on the North Shore. That breakdown made me take 2 hours to get from the University of Sydney to the Harbour Bridge that had nothing to do with it. Nothing at all. But the system is so fragile and increasingly fragile that any dilemma in that system, so if we don't have a redundant system, a system that has multiple paths, we have a bad system. And this is an unconnected system. Road systems that don't connect, you can't go by foot to the grocery store, etc., all reliant on automobiles. This is a system that cannot succeed, both because of the things I mentioned before, and I'm going to talk about later, but it's a system that can't succeed. So part of our infrastructure design has to be to redesign the places in which the infrastructure is placed. And that is a hard ask. Because if we don't do that, we increase this natural hazard exposure. Now, I've been working on disasters and things for, several decades. And my work keeps going up, 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 and up. Almost every day, there's a new so-called natural disaster. How many people here are from Beijing? Nobody from Beijing? Anybody from Manila? Those are called natural disasters. Natural disasters. A rain, just an ordinary rain, is a natural disaster because of the poor building systems. We've paved over much of the land that would absorb the water. So these natural hazards are hazards we've created. We've created a system that is no longer livable, and as we expand and pave over the world, we're making more vulnerable places. So who done it isn't the question. The question is who's going to undo it. Because these little things, little drop of rain we're just having here and hasn't caused any problem yet, but those little drops of rain represent heating of the globe, changing of our total temperature system, so that we become increasingly vulnerable. And those vulnerabilities are increasing because we're using the wrong solutions for our problem. I just had a conference, a green conference, 2 weeks ago, and the major speakers all talked about how we get more energy by creating from other sources, basically petrol. How we could get petrol out of wheat and grain. How we get petrol out of membranes. I said, guys, this is a green conference. This is not sponsored by Exxon. The idea is to move away from that. And this is Canada, where the United States and Canada will be so-called energy independent by polluting the world. So not to say that we're any better. The emissions continue to go up. I needn't go through this because you are all converted. But we have to stop killing the system because the sea is rising, maybe not as bad as it was, but as these glaciers melt, there's only one natural consequence from that. So with sea level rising that you can see all over the world, and those of you from India, if you're from Mumbai, I suggest selling that property right now. And if you're here on the Arabian Peninsula, if you don't have a bathing suit, I'd buy one. So, even northern part of, much of the United States, it's very dangerous. And here we are on the east coast of this continent. So what kind of infrastructure are we going to design for the consequences of this? We have to design this future shock infrastructure. This is what Manhattan's going to look like in the next storm. Not 150 or 100 years from now. This is what Manhattan's going to look like. And we're going to have to get used to this. That we're going to have. Now, why is Manhattan like this? And I want to give you, I got my first degree in history, and I may be off, and so some of you might want to challenge it. One of the reasons Manhattan is like this is because for 600 years, in the 14th, 13th, and 12th century, you couldn't cross the Atlantic. The storms, the weather was too bad. We had many ice ages and so forth. The temperature cooled. We had a moderate period. So this guy Columbus, looking for India, falls in, finds North America. And it's too bad they didn't start in California. But nonetheless, he finds this place. And what do? We build in the closest places. We build on the shorelines. And we did this all over the world. We took advantage of the fact because we had steel and iron ore and so forth. We started building in places that were previously uninhabitable. So now we are luring people into those same places. And so our infrastructure for tomorrow, the only people I've seen who seem to be doing anything about this are the Dutch, where they're floating some of the places. We have to be prepared to float a lot of our infrastructure, or we'll be doing this. So we have to start taking a back step. We have built the wrong things in the wrong places in the wrong ways. Maybe we can, and the Dutch have spent a lot of their GDP on corrective systems. I was just in Holland looking at the systems that you guys have put in place. But those systems don't come free. They cost, 3 or 4% of the GDP every year to maintain them. And they have to be expanded. And that's what I was working on. They have to be expanded just to keep the country where it is. Now, many of our countries are not looking at these new wetter, hotter conditions. And so when we are thinking here at the Smart Infrastructure Facility, and those of you who are working the same space, we have to be a lot smarter about the consequences and what's coming. Because if we aren't, people say, you guys knew, and why didn't you tell us? And we're talking a lot to ourselves, and you know that. We are going to have to develop some better communications because this is real. The IPPC just said it this past week. It's real, and it's getting worse. And this is my New Orleans public officials, paralyzed. And here's our Aussies, waiting it out. We're pretty good at that. That's my favorite haunt. And here's our contribution to the problem. More coal, more iron ore. So we have to start comparing other things because the rain we just had, normally, everyone said the garden's getting rained at. Well, the first thing I thought of is, how big are the fires? How big will the fires be? It's going to be very hot this summer. We're going to have a lot of fires. Now, how do we plan for that? How do we start modeling that so that we don't have this kind of failed infrastructure like in New Orleans? Everybody in New Orleans knew for 20 years New Orleans was vulnerable and did nothing. And this is the consequences of what happened in New Orleans. Totally ruined. Houses moved kilometers away. So this is New Orleans' hurricane readiness program before the storm. It doesn't look too secure to me. So rescuing and prevention is a lot cheaper than rescue. So we have to start preventing these kinds of calamities. These roads are not falling apart because there's an earthquake or something. They're falling apart because of bad building. So we have to start building infrastructure that's going to be more tolerant of the heat, the water, and all the conditions I've talked about. And this facility and other facilities have to model those conditions. And we are going to have to model conditions that nobody's going to want to hear. But fortunately, at my age, I'm able to say it. I told the people in New Orleans, you're going to move. People in Holland said, you're going to move. And we moved people in New Orleans. And people call me all kinds of nasty names. Now my first name is never mentioned. But quietly, they say, thank God that guy came. What was he, an Australian? Couldn't have been an American. He's got too much guts. So we have to, as scientists, start taking our game to the field where it has to be played, and that's in city councils and in communities. So we don't rebuild this kind of stuff, and we don't rebuild this kind of stuff. This is a civic center that probably would have fallen down, with you blowing hard on the front door. But can you imagine a glass civic center in New Orleans where the water is 14 feet above it? It doesn't make a lot of sense, does it? So we have to start thinking about what the uneven consequences are of poor preparation, poor infrastructure, poor design, and who can rebuild where. The old stuff in New Orleans lasted because it was built in the right places. I've got to tell you this little story because I'm part Native American. The story is when the white man arrived, and there are a lot of pelts and so forth, and they're picking out the pelts, and the white man said, well, we're going to start a city here. Indians, you move. Indians say, we move, but we move our TP all the time because river move. White man said, well, I'm not worried about the river. No Indians were killed in the disaster. You notice that? So our people are pretty smart. They have adapted to the conditions. We've got to adapt our cities to the conditions and start moving them around. It's got to be a holistic approach. And I noticed in the program you're talking about many portions of this problem, but we've got to put it all together. The entire systems approach to how we build, how we rebuild, and how we adapt the existing systems. Nobody's going to take this. Unless you have a New Orleans, nobody's going to take this. I'm working on New York right now. We've got to adapt New York. We've got to have let some places flood. So if you have property in Fire Island, kiss it goodbye. We cannot save Fire Island and all those islands off the coast of New Jersey. We have to save Lower Manhattan. So, 6 principles. Place, creating, and generating infrastructure. We have to start thinking about, particularly when we're building new places, how that infrastructure is going to be creative and organized, not just to create the space, but to make that space attractive for people to live and work in for many decades and generations. And what we do now is we do an environmental analysis and say that, 1 in 100. So it's okay to build here. It won't be a flood for 100 years. 100 years? 1 in 100 does not mean 100 years. It means 1 in 100 chances, like walking across the street against the light. So we have to start being very smart about how we tell people how to generate infrastructure in the place and what to put in it, what kind of physical form. I am very much for the decentralized approach, matching infrastructure to the place rather than trying to make large-scale systems that are very vulnerable. Had we done that, had we had decentralized infrastructure in New Orleans, more of the city would have been saved. Human capital building infrastructure. How do we build structures, and I'm talking about in the future, I want to move away from the single-use building. I don't want to see schools built just as schools anymore. Schools will be civic facilities that you can change into a child care center, a senior center, housing, or whatever, built in the right location to carry the capacity for 100 years or more. Single-use facilities are a big mistake. And telemobility, that we have to have very strong telemobility. I think, congratulations, new governments here, big mistake. NBN, don't stop the NBN, because later on, when we need it, it will not be there. The Koreans and everybody else has it, and we won't have it, we will not be competitive. So we've got to have mobility everywhere. That's one of the reasons I was stuck, because people cannot work from other alternate locations. We've got to start decentralizing work using telecommunication systems. And social capital infrastructure is very important, building complete, ethnically mixed communities, not the homogeneous community anymore. Affordable, multicultural communities have to be our future, and new governance infrastructure, more governance in different forms, regional councils, regional institutions, regional infrastructure banks, all those things. let's give up on the National Infrastructure Bank. Let's start on the Regional Infrastructure Bank. Obama's not going to get a National Infrastructure Bank, but California's already got an infrastructure bank. And pretty soon there'll be 50 of them in the states. So we've got to have those infrastructure banks because infrastructure is not a local problem. So the future is this, where we're going to spend less money on the fossil fuels. We're going to save money by moving away from those systems. And so the infrastructure of the future has to be designed now. We've got to start moving toward an integrated solar, wind, and other systems, tidal and so forth, to produce the energy we need. The Europeans are already moving in that direction. We've got to move in that direction very quickly. The Japanese absolutely have to move in that direction. So we have to start creating that infrastructure. This facility and other facilities that you're from have to start modeling the real cost of the old system and unbury all those hidden costs of maintaining that grid system. Because when you start unpacking it, a cheaper system, building a new system is going to be cheaper than maintaining the old one. And we've got to do it soon. So we can't build a safe building. We have to build safe regions and safe communities. And that's what this is all about. We've got to restructure the whole governance system. And it's good for all of us to live in our nice little villages and so on. But the new system has to be a regional system, and regional infrastructure has to service it. And that regional, and I'm not going to define whether that's 300 kilometers or 200 kilometers or what, but everyone knows what the work shed is, the environmental shed and so forth. The Hudson Bay is perfect. You can tell up to Connecticut where that ends, and the water flows down to New York and New Jersey and so forth. That is a complete system. And we have a complete system here from Wollongong all the way to Newcastle with the range of mountains. That is the region. It's not Shell Harbor. The region is that, and we've got a plan for that because people move in it. 1 in 3 Sydney-siders moves every year. So that system has to be very flexible and very fungible. And we cannot waste land like this. We've got to have better density. I'm not calling that higher density. That's just better density and less space. And we can do all that. But the thing I just mentioned earlier, all the facilities we build in the future must be community facilities. This can be the gym, the school, the post office, all those things. And this is where the solar power is located. This is where the other energy systems are located. This is where the rescue operation comes from. We should not evacuate out, we evacuate inward, the way the Japanese do. This is the future. The future is having buildings that produce energy, not buildings that absorb energy. And we've got to start with public buildings, and they have to be multi-use, multi-time use, and building healthy communities by design. I'm very proud of this in Los Angeles. We put public health at the center of the design of a new community on the west side, and that community is now one of the places that everybody wants to live in because these small parks have water under them. We generate electricity here. We have food grown here. We've got to start building communities that fit the people and where people can survive in that community no matter what happens. Better density. This is Portland, Oregon. Here's where your infrastructure core is. And this is your park, your playground, and so on. These alleyways, the cars are behind them. They carry the other house infrastructure. You don't see any poles here, any of that kind of stuff. This is a city, this is a place designed for people with quality infrastructure where people can live throughout their ages, young, old, and so forth. They can move from a single family house into multiple units and so forth, all within walking distance. That's the kind of system that we need, and we have to future-proof every neighborhood and every community. Retro-proofing, because many of our communities You've got to do this. You've got to take the people living near the shore, you've got to move that houses down there up to there. So, and we have to start giving people grants and other things to do that. Some of that's going to be this, what we did in New Orleans. We made strategic open spaces around the city to save the city, so the water, I learned this from the Dutch, can run through the city. You got to learn to live with the water, not try to keep it out. The city was spending millions of dollars a year to pump the water out of the city. One pump breaks and it's over. So we've got to design with nature. That is part of the infrastructure ask. It is not pipes. It's how we use the land and the land system as well. So through 4 principles: determine that green space pattern, estimating the surface and the surface temperatures that you're going to have by paving things over, using more impervious surface. All this is part of the infrastructure ask. And when you're planning a community, everyone now, and most places around the world, is doing the easiest thing, not the smartest thing. So we're redoing Parramatta, the center of Parramatta, and the center of Liverpool. And I brought in some guys to do a complete analysis of the entire land mass, all the underground systems, so forth, before we start doing any building. The mayor and the general manager are all for it, and the council's gone for it, because they took a trip with me to the United States, and we talked about what smart cities look like and how they work, and we worked together on coming up with a completely different approach to designing their cities. And that's what we're going to have to do. We've got to take them on that journey, helping them understand that they're smart, and I'm going to show some of those smart outcomes that they can have in their cities that are a lot smarter than what they're doing. And moving, this is the civic heart of New Orleans. This is the civic heart of Lower Manhattan that we designed, and we designed New Orleans after that, a place that is really livable. Floating structures, hydroponics, all this has to be part of this. We cannot think of this as just wires and cables. It has to be livable space. And here's an excellent example in Los Angeles of letting the water move through the city. Simple, smart infrastructure. The city was going to spend $2 billion in underground piping. This is going to cost about $120 million and save the city. You know, LA Power and Water, you know, $120 million is a decimal point problem. $2 billion is what they talk about in the budget. But we don't have to spend a lot of money, we have to spend a lot of smarts. Portland, Oregon. Water steps, water under the steps. Why the water under the steps? Because when something happens, you want to be able to pump water for fires, you want to be able to pump water for emergencies, you have drinking waters. Keep it local. These big systems where you have to capture water and pump it up to some reservoir and pump it back to the city should be dead. We've got to start thinking about capturing water where it is and use it smart and use it many, many times, and producing food closer to where it's consumed. Now, I don't know how many rooftops are going to be producing food, but we've got an awful lot of space along our railroad tracks and so on where we could start producing food right now. Very underutilized space in almost every place I've been. And all types of communities have to be built, but the one I don't want to see built is this one, because it only takes probably one white ant to eat the whole damn thing. You know, that may be easy, quick building. I don't know how this probably was a mountain at one time. They knocked it down because they're calling this Mountain View. So whenever you hear something called, when you hear something called Mountain View, that means the developer knocked down a mountain for it. If you call it River View, that means the river was covered over to put it in. So moving water through communities rather than burying it has got to be the future. This is Los Angeles again, a new park built over a whole cistern system. So this is the kind of building we're going to have to do in the future that is maybe not be the cheapest, but it'll certainly be the more resilient and cleanest and smartest, and we have to build cleaner, better, more defensible spaces. And this is the kind of building we're going to have to do, where this building is on the second floor in flood areas, and the kids can play there, there's grass there, there's all the kind of things you need. But that's the smart infrastructure starts with the system, the settlement pattern. It doesn't start with the pipe. So I'm urging you all to help us build better places and smarter places. This is our Future Cities program where we're doing that. We took 6 cities in this year at the University of Sydney, put them through analysis of what their problems were. They all came out with a smarter view of what they could do, how they could renew spaces like the High Line here in New York, how they could introduce bicycles, and how they could build buildings in better ways. These buildings are built over a parking structure and what was a landfill. So, smart building, afforder, mixed housing. Our poor Prime Minister embarrassed by our quality building in Queensland. But opportunities are all over the world, and we've got to seek out those opportunities, work together in this forum and others to build the new smart building. Smart building infrastructure is a smart export. And that's the export of the future. It is not coal, it is not iron ore, it is not oil. It is how to build smart communities. And that's what this facility is about. That's what we have to do. And another piece of that is smart financing. Value capture. When you build a building and it's 2 stories, the stories above that it goes to 16 stories, the government has to get a piece of that action. The owner can't take all 16 stories. In New York, you lease that airspace. Every place else, you capture that value. We could build, and I worked on this, we could build the very fast train in Australia without a penny of public money by doing exactly what the United States did when it built its railroads. Capturing the value along the rail lines. We can build all the infrastructure we need in Sydney by capturing the value, and that's smart infrastructure. The smart infrastructures are coupling the financing, the building, the design with the equipment. And that's the systems approach. This is what we're doing here in China. This is what we're doing in other parts of the world. The instruments of finance, building a high-speed rail national productivity connector. That's smart infrastructure, the NBN, and all these things. Their airport in Canberra, and so connecting that with the airport here, creating value and designing safe communities, creating livable, resilient futures for everybody. That's what people want. They don't want to talk about buildings. They want to talk about the future of their communities and how we can design them. And that means, I think, a decentralized approach. That if I were running the planning system in Sydney, I'd say every region, they now have to have a jobs, a housing. But no one's mentioned the environment. They have these goals they have to reach. No one's mentioned the environment. No one's interested in food. No one's has mentioned resilience. Every neighborhood, every area has to have all those things. I guess I'm getting the bill. But if we don't build resilient communities and resilient neighborhoods, we cannot build resilient regions. And this is the kind of infrastructure. It is not expensive. It's smart. It's easily maintained. Storage of water and so forth, recyclable. A report card that everybody can see, transparent, good, quick, easy, smart stuff with smart young people. Getting young people, like some of you in the audience and so forth. We need more young people pointing us into the future and building the smart infrastructure we need. Like this young man in Los Angeles, building new housing that is smarter. These people working on new biosystems, cleaning up the act in Buffalo, stop polluting the rivers and the waterways and so forth, the university, underwater systems, underwater energy systems, remaking and reducing waste and waste recycling. This is all smart infrastructure. We shouldn't be sending stuff out to dumps and so forth. We should be taking that waste in our own communities and small regional areas using biosystems to reproduce energy we need. And those technologies are already here. So our smart infrastructure here does all this kind of stuff. And every neighborhood, every community needs to have a Wollongong smart facility in it, benchmarking where it is, where it's going, and what it can contribute to the world. Making these kinds of communities. This is the kind of design we start with. Redesigning the whole place. We don't want this. That's what we don't want. But we want the future to be a place that we can manage and introduce new smart management systems and smart safety systems and smart housing systems. But public officials are on the horns of a dilemma. Everyone says it costs too much. It only costs too much if you think you're going to use operating capital. But if you capture the value of the future, you can do it now. That's how we built the Harbor Bridge. People forget the Harbor Bridge was paid for with something called a toll. We do that all the time. Value capture is nothing more than tolling the sky, tolling the lands around the place. Very smart. I'm going to leave this behind. Here's all the kinds of stuff we can use with our existing systems to measure where we are. And who's for this? I did a poll, scientific. You know how I am. I got constituents to say they kind of liked it. And these new ideas have to come from all over the world. If we're going to have clean beaches, clean places, it comes from everywhere. All of you are a part of it. But we're in Australia. We want to win that race. Thank you.